Hello there, everybody, and welcome back to another video here on Star Wars Lads. This week we are continuing our Legends Book Club. We haven't done this since the end of October, but we are finally back to Legends Book Club, and we are doing what you all voted on for this month, Shatterpoint, the story about Mace Windu during the Clone Wars initiative in 2003 to 2005 that bridged the gap between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. So we will be diving into that novel. But before we do so, please hit that like button down below and subscribe to our channel for continued Star Wars content. We have a ton of stuff coming out this month, despite there being no show. So you're going to want to stick around with our channel for all of that great content. We've already released some great videos so far. So make sure you check those out. And then next month, and pretty much for the first half of the entire year next year, we will be covering The Bad Batch and The Mandalorian Season 3. So make sure you're coming back to Star Wars Lads for all of your coverage of the latest and greatest in Star Wars movies and shows. We'll also be covering the High Republic next year as well and continuing all the great stuff. And you're not going to want to miss our yearly wrap up stuff that we're going to do here. We're going to rank our top 10 favorite Star Wars stories of the year, as well as give you guys our most anticipated Star Wars stories next year. So we're going to cover everything here in the world of Star Wars. Make sure you're sticking around and subscribing to our channel for all of that content. Give us a like and then comment below. Let us know what you think of Shatterpoint if you've read it, or if you hear our thoughts and you now want to read it or dive in. Let us know what you think. We love to interact with you guys, and we hope you comment below and let us know your opinions. So let's get into Shatterpoint here. We do have a structure for these videos similar to our book reviews. We will cover first the writing and the plot before getting into characters, impact on Star Wars history, and then our overall thoughts and scores out of 5. So let's dive into the first section here, the writing, the plot, the story, all the general stuff that makes this book what it is. Senek, what were your thoughts on Shatterpoint?
I don't think I have ever hidden this opinion on this channel, but I am not the biggest fan of Mace Windu. So there was always going to be a little bit of bias, a little bit of an angle that I was reading this book at, and I tried my best not to. And I think for that mentality, at least made my experience reading this book pretty interesting. Um, I think Matthew Stover also being the writer definitely really helped out here because I did enjoy his novelization of Revenge of the Sith as a kid. I still think that's one of the best Star Wars books ever. Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the writing, it is well written. Um, but I think it's an interesting read because there's a good amount of detail throughout every single page that if you're really trying to get absorbed into this book, especially if you're like a fan of Mace and you want to know really what his thinking is, the story structure is in the sense that yeah, there are three big parts. There's the plot that's happening, but there's also like Mace's journaling, his observations, how he's feeling. And for me, that's always been like my biggest critique for Mace Windu. He's a guy who is just kind of rude, doesn't care about Anakin, all these different things. But how does he think is not really something that we get to see in the 2008 Clone Wars, 2003 Clone Wars. He's mostly just a big fighting machine. Stover here, he at least lets us dig underneath a couple layers of that skin, understanding that Mace doesn't really smile anymore, that he struggled with the Jedi losing their connection to the Force throughout the prequels, those tidbits with his relationship with Depa and Vappa, the lightsaber form, all that stuff I thought was great. But when the other parts were not as successful for me, I think the plot is quite good after we get past some initial setup. That just feels like a lot of detail, just a lot of buildup of like Mace being this big tough guy, as we've all seen on the screen. But when he kind of goes back to his home planet and we get to see a little bit more of him literally marching into the heart of darkness, which is what this book is based off of, heart of darkness in space. Um, that's where the plot really absorbed me, really gripped me, and then especially his relationship to a culture that is his, but isn't because he's a Jedi. But I think the plot does take a significant hit at the last portion of the story because that's when we kind of bring in the Clone Wars itself. We get to bring in a lot more of like the actual clones, the CIS in droid fighters, all that stuff, and it gets really muddled. There's a lot of like quick, rapid decisions being made, a lot of like changes in allegiance and stuff like that, backstabbing. It all just happens really quickly, and I'd like to say maybe the last 30, 40 pages, him being so aware of quite literally like galactic level battle and warfare on the planet in space, all that was just it was kind of hard to follow, and it just kind of ended after that for me. There's like maybe like a 2-page epilogue of sorts, and I think this is probably where that early 2003 initiative. It was kind of hard to figure out the direction of the storytelling spread across mediums at that point. That is a pretty new thing, so I'll give Stover a little bit of slack there. But I mean, overall, I'd say if you can really get into this book and you're like a Mace Windu fan, especially, there is a lot of meaty goodness in there, and Stover is still page by page a great writer.
The writing was one of the best parts of this, and it elevates the material significantly from the first page. Really, you can tell this is not just a standard sci-fi writer, a standard Star Wars writer that's coming in and trying to incorporate elements. This is like a writer, a real real seasoned, excellent writer who is grappling with Star Wars material, and I think that elevates a lot of it. I really like this book. I think it is extremely well written, very detailed, very dark, very gritty, very violent, really on a level that you don't see in Star Wars books, especially in canon, but and almost anything else I've ever read besides something like Death Troopers, which is supposed to be a horror story and supposed to be gory with its writing. There's such a kinetic nature to the way he writes action scenes, the way you feel every single little punch Mace Windu throws, everything that is done here with the action, especially, I thought was really, really well written. I do like Mace's arc here, and we'll talk about that in the character section, but I think he really does a great job writing character. And as a story, this book, kind of like some of the we've talked about, Star Wars can either fall into two different types of books. Usually they're character books and then they're story books. This is definitely a character book with the overarching Clone Wars initiative going on at the time, and this being written in the early stage of that, this coming out in 2003 when the Clone Wars was just starting, so we didn't even have really the end game of where that was going. Probably only initial ideas were probably given to Stover from Lucas for what Revenge of the Sith was. This is definitely a character book, and the Clone Wars is at the backdrop, which I think makes this book a little more timeless than something you might read that really heavily references the Clone Wars that might not be canon anymore, where this can really grapple with the character Mace Windu specifically. The world built here, I think, adds a nice layer to it. The way Matthew Stover is able to describe the different types of groups, the different factions, the different religions, the way the Force is used in different ways, the way it permeates different people, connections it builds between characters, and also the way it's able to be manipulated by different people, by the villains, by all of the people around this world. It really creates a vibrant, living, breathing space that it really doesn't feel like too many other cultures that were built, especially in the Clone Wars era of novels that we've gotten, both in canon and legend. So I think for that, I appreciated really a kind of a deep dive look into war specifically, not just giving us people existing on the outskirts, and it's nice to have it at the centralized with a character who is somebody we all know, somebody we all recognize, but somebody we don't really get under the skin of ever besides this book. I think that's a good way to transition into our character section, because we do have Mace Windu, who is on the cover. He is this book's main protagonist. He is this book's lead character. He's in every chapter. In the first two thirds, basically, you get his POV in every single chapter with him writing his journals, which, again, like Sanak said, I thought that was one of my favorite parts of the entire book. I really liked hearing him. And sometimes first person perspective doesn't necessarily work for me in Star Wars. I thought that was really good here and really, really, really well written. Felt very faithful to the character. But we have Mace Windu, who's our main character. We also have Depa Billaba, who is his apprentice and has fallen into this group of people, the Coronai, who she is supposed to be protecting. She's now with them, and Mace has to go get her. We also have kind of the main villain, but also the gray nature of most of the characters in this book. We have Carvaster, who is his main antagonistic force, Mace Windu, in this. And then we have some of the other side characters like Nick and some of the other members of Coronai who we get appearances from, but really it's the three of Carvaster, Depa Billaba, and Mace Windu who anchor this book. Sonic, what were your thoughts on the way Mace and Depa were written, but also some of our other characters here in this novel?
I wish that we got a little bit more with Depa, but I mean, we are going with the whole Heart of Darkness, the Colonel, especially a little bit more of the Marlon Brando version where when we see her, it's very much like in glimpses. It's kind of the after effects. That I mean, I wouldn't say that was disappointing. It was just I want a little bit more because there's like a lot of reverence that Mace Windu puts for Depa Billaba. He was pretty open about like how this girl came into his life. It was just perfect, and so proud of her. Yoda wanted to say like, "Oh, she's on this council so early because of your training," but he's like, "No, it's her." And there's like those interesting tidbits of like on like a mission at Nar Shaddaa, she actually surpassed him, the creator of Apad, into a different level, and it brought a tear to his eye. Like it was beautiful and all that. So right, it's that responsibility of Mace that I think has always been there in his character, and I really enjoyed that. And I think that dynamic, I just wish was a little bit more present because, as you said, it is a first person point of view, and that works wonderfully for Mace, and it really helps the Depa character, the atrocities that she's committing, the struggles that she's facing, that whenever she's actually in the same room as Mace, it's like there's so much conflicted moments, great things. Like you want to feel sorry for her, you want to see her be better, but then you're also just witnessing the aftermaths of her like massacring like a hangar of clones and stuff like that. It's crazy, and I think I really enjoyed that dynamic. Nick Ross too, I thought was a pretty fun character, pretty funny. He kind of starts off as like a very gray character. That whole Corin group is very gray, as with the whole separatist spy that Mace was with. He's one of those like characters that is written because he kind of has to be the grounding element. Like this is who we'd be in the Star Wars story, that we see a lot, especially in canon novels. But I think he was used a little bit better here, where a lot of canon novels like High Republic and whatnot, they put a lot of focus on this character who's only going to ever be in one book, sometimes becoming our central point of view. Whereas here, he was a good supporting point of view. When we had tidbits with him, they felt earned and justified, had a good connection with the story, good connection with the depth, the darkness, the goriness, everything. I mean, in a way, we have to, because it is a Heart of Darkness story. We do have to talk about the planet as a character. I think it's pretty fair to point that out. I mean, he comes from this home planet of Haruun Kal, and supposedly, like I said, the Jedi during the Sith War, which is like a huge thing, forced landed on the planet, and this jungle has metal eating, left them stranded, and their descendants are become the Ghost Tribe, the Ghost Windu, the Ghost whatever, and in a way, Mace is returning to like an ancestral conflict because his main overtly evil person, even if he has layers in the Carvastor, a lot of that stuff is so generationally built, if not millennially built. And Mace also has that responsibility to kind of deal with that, kind of dealing with your own heritage and all that. I thought that was a really cool dynamic. Even if I don't think he was the richest there, it was that dynamic that was really fun to see. Yeah, I mean, I again, the characters are the highlight for me of this book because he also brings them into his journaling, his reflections on a lot of these characters, seeing a lot of them die in front of him, the things that he has to do, like, euthanize someone and cut them up. That was a crazy dark scene to see in this book. So really fun characters. I think I just wish that there was a little bit more of the Depa stuff.
I agree with the Depa point. I think with this book, before having read it being sold as Heart of Darkness and Star Wars, I was really looking for those scenes. In a way, you get them. There's one that is literally described like word for word the way it looks on screen when you see that famous shot of Marlon Brando, and even Depa says the horror, the horror. Like you get that scene, right? I wanted a bit more scenes, but in a way, also when the book ends, Depa's appearances are so random and chaotic, it really fits the way her character is thinking in this book. One scene, she's very much so like, "Yes, Mace, I'm back. Like I'm a Jedi." Then the next scene, she's like, "I'm a Jedi, but I'm the new Jedi. I need to evolve and to be what we need to be in order to win this war." And in other ways, she's just completely traumatized. So there are so many different scenes and so many different sides of Depa that what really you never know what you're getting. And when you think you've had her solved, the next scene she's completely different and completely more broken than she was before. So in a way, I think that pulling away from Depa and leaving that desire to have more is almost, with those first person scenes with Mace, a way for you to almost get a little bit in touch with who Mace is and his desire to just completely beg for the old Depa back, to try to get who she is out of her, and peel back those layers, which ultimately he never really can. This is obviously the best thing Mace Windu's ever been in. Getting his perspective is so nice to finally, George Lucas, I think especially, and then carried on by Dave Filoni throughout the Clone Wars when George Lucas was working on the show as well. They want you distant from Mace because Mace is supposed to be that distant character, that character who is just so infatuated with the rules and being a symbol of being the Jedi, being the master of the order. Nobody can touch him. We're supposed to get kind of a detached from him and see him as a symbol of detachment in the prequels and in the Clone Wars 2008 and all of that stuff. But here it is nice to finally at least get some type of look at the way he thinks, the way he operates, how he justifies those beliefs and that hubris with his origins and his roots, and getting to learn about that he grew up here on Haruun Kal and came back for a trial even when he was a Jedi Padawan. A lot of that molded and shaped him. The jungle is what has shaped him. And then Carvaster as his complete opposite, and having Carvaster basically be Mace Windu if Mace never left Haruun Kal and never became a Jedi. I think both work as a nice parallel and a nice opposite side of the coin type scenario. Carr doesn't have too many layers to him, but what he does provide, I think, is that dark side of Mace. It is the Mace who went sane, basically, like Depa describes as for her character. So I think both of those characters work very nicely. Nick was a character who at first I was like, oh no, this is kind of killing the vibe, the darkness, the true like war tone to this book, the Apocalypse Now tone. But by the end, that and Mace Windu and Nick had a really nice special relationship, and I really dug the way they played off each other, getting under Nick's skin as well, peeling back those layers of sarcasm and goofiness, and seeing who he is underneath and how he's formed into who he is. I think this book is one of the best character books you will read in Star Wars, in my opinion. I think it does such a great job peeling back the layers of its characters over time. And I want to echo what you said. Haroon Kal as a character is the force that's always peeling those back. And with these characters, especially the references to the Ghost Windu and the way Carvaster is connected to the Force, and all the Kornai are connected to the Force, Haroon Kal and the Force, everything is married together so nicely to continually peel back those characters and give us more and more sides to them, both mentally, spiritually, emotionally. I think it all works really, really well. And ultimately, I think the character stuff is the most satisfying all the way throughout the book from beginning to end. So let's talk about our third section here, one we didn't really cover in Death Troopers, but we are back covering impact on Star Wars history. Shatterpoint itself might not have had a specific impact on Star Wars history with its plot, but its characters have become major parts of canon, and a lot of them are very different. So, Senek, what were some of the things you pulled out of Shatterpoint that kind of caught you by surprise when comparing it to even later legends, but also mostly canon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty important to point out that when you think about Legends, 2008 Clone Wars doesn't disappear. A lot of it, yeah, at least the first 5, 6 seasons, you have to consider them as both Legends and canon. And this book opens up with, you know, Mace kind of trying to think back on like, man, I could have seen the Shatterpoint here. I could have just, even if I died, taken down Jango Fett. He's most ferocious fighter in this galaxy. I would have died to him, all this and stuff, right? But if I had just deflected it into Dooku, we could have ended this war here. Like this, thousands could have been killed, sure, but what more than millions of people being affected, if not trillions, in the galaxy? And I thought that was pretty interesting because he does have some trauma about it. Like and even in other scenes when he sees like dead clone troopers in this book, there he doesn't want it to like really hit him, but he does feel something that he can't really describe, and it's like a pang. It's just a reminder, like of like what he deems as a failure of himself. So he's very hard on himself in this book, and that's what I wished that we got to see in the TV shows. But Mace is more like a Kiadi Monday, where he's like a stickler, and he's the stickler of the Jedi Order. I wish that was something that was carried over by Lucas and Filoni, because I think that was what Stover really handled well here. That even if he is a hard ass of a character, he does have very human flaws and very human reactions to things. And I think the Jango Fett one was a pretty interesting one, especially because it also affects his relationship with the clones. He doesn't refer to them by any names. And I know names kind of became more of a thing in 2008, but there's like five different designations for these clones. And there's even moments where they like think about their personalities and all that, but they're just referenced by that number. And it makes sense being from Mace's perspective that they're just, they're tools. And in a way, he doesn't even treat them as purely human. And I think that is what carries over in the Clone Wars. He's a little bit more respectful there. The respect that Mace has at this very beginning for Palpatine, like he likes Palpatine quite a bit in this book, more so than he does in Episode 3. He kind of plays off a bit more of the Episode 2 characterization, where they're still like, yeah, this guy Palpatine's new age like us, like I respect him. And Yoda even makes a comment about that here, of like, you both are like the newer characters, the newer Jedi, the newer politicians. So maybe that's why you guys get along. But I think the biggest thing, obviously, is the Depa Billaba stuff, and especially because if you want to treat this book as one of the few that could still kind of fit your head canon, that canon itself is kind of treating as like, yeah, it's kind of mostly all there. We have Mace Windu, we have his Padawan Depa Billaba, and then her Padawan is Kanan, right? And the Kanan comics, as much as the initial stuff with Order 66 has been changed, if you treat everything else as like as on paper, you literally see a young Kanan walk by her in her back to take. So whatever dramatic has happened has been played directly into Kanan's character. Now, I wish Kanan had a little bit more knowledge of his master, but it is a very short-lived relationship. He just feels a pull towards her in those comics, and then it just kind of goes from there. I think the Bad Batch version of Depa Billaba, she's not a Vapad user. I don't really think she would be, because she goes down fairly easily. But yeah, there's these things that are like 80% there in some ways. Mace Windu stuff, I feel, is like pick and choose, but the Depa Billaba stuff was perfectly expanded on in canon. And if you're a canon junkie like us, honestly, this is one of the few books that you could truly say is like, yeah, I would consider it canon as well.
It definitely can fit, like you were saying. It's the outcome for Depa at the end of this book is definitely different, or really in Legends is definitely different than where she's positioned in season 7, Bad Batch, and then ultimately where she dies in the Kanan comics as well. One of the things I still find hard to believe from reading this, if we're trying to connect it back to canon, is that she would have a Padawan at this point. She does not seem like in the state to take a Padawan, and there's the references to her probably being arrested and removed from the Jedi Order in this rather than continue. So there are those things. Also, the minor thing of her having a blue lightsaber and in a Bad Batch, and she has a green one in this. I agree about the Vapod thing. She goes down way too easily to, especially where it's described in this book. She goes down way too easily to be of a pod user in canon. So I would throw that out the window. In general, this book's legacy is really what it does for the character of Mace Windu. And in a way, I kind of wish that 6-year-old me read this before seeing Revenge of the Sith, because it would add a nice layer to Mace Windu. But ultimately, yeah, I think that's the extent of really its impact on Star Wars history, is the character stuff. It fleshes out these characters really nicely, and for Mace, I think it adds a much needed layer to his character and a much needed layer to his origin that really makes him different from pretty much any Jedi you read. Got to have something that distinguishes him, especially because he's so young compared to a lot of these other Jedi Masters who have been on the Council for a long time. To be named Master of the Order, this book gives you a reason why. And in canon right now, we don't really have a reason why. He is just the guy. So I would love to see some of this fleshed out. Man, can you imagine a series with Sam Jackson doing this crazy stuff? Like, that would be insane. I'd love to do a version of that, and maybe in a different way with Depa altered a little bit. This gives us our first true real war story, real Clone Wars grounded Clone Wars war story look that we've really never gotten before. And I think that's the legacy it still holds, and that's what it does so well. So let's move on to final
Yeah.
thoughts and overall scores. Sonic, what would you give this book out of 5?
During the recording of this, I think my score has actually gone up from what I was initially with this discussion. It's a great read in a vacuum. If you were, following very closely like the 2003 initiative, you would have been a fan of like a character like Quinlan Voss in the 2003 Clone Wars comics with the Republic line and all that. You would have maybe been a Gendy Tarkovsky fan, and you're like, I want to see Mace Windu do crazy stuff like that. And there are scenes where he does crazy things in this book too. It's just one of those books that I think needed way more continuation. That when you look at the journaling, I'm like, yeah, I wish we got a little bit more than what we ended up. When you see the Depa Billaba stuff, I'm like, well, it works in terms of the sort of character archetypes he's trying to fit into, but I'd have loved a little bit more exploration there. Honestly, this was one of those books that I wish was like double the length. I wish it was like a serious, incredible deep dive into everything that was going on with Mace Windu, but then allowed us to more cleanly fit in a lot of the more Clone Wars era storyline. So for me, I think it's kind of a little bit of biased way of looking at it, but I feel like because the legacy of this book is kind of minimal until new canon, essentially, I'll give it like a 3.75. It's very close to a 4 for me.
This book is one of my favorite character books I've read in Star Wars. I think it handles a character that's been so blank and mysterious and really uninspired for a long time and turns him into somebody who has a lot of ethical decisions that he makes every time, somebody who's haunted by the past, somebody who has actual character connections and emotions and relationships with people, and it does so much for a character that's for so long has just been cool. Now he's cool and has layers to him. I keep saying now, this book's 19 years old, so having read this now, it adds so much to the character Mace Windu for me. I love the elements of Hearts of Darkness brought in here, all the elements of Apocalypse Now, imagery used directly out of it, I think all works so well. Really, the fleshing out of Haruun Kal, Depa Billaba, Car Vaster, I think all of the character relationships for me work so well in this book. I am a bigger fan of the first 2/3, like you said, but I think getting to see that side of General Windu, getting to see all those experiences that he's built up over the first 2/3 of the book and seeing them all plugged into the final third, seeing him have to basically try to counter Depa in a battle of wits, I thought was also a nice touch, and I really enjoyed really all their conflict. To me, it's arguably the best character book I've ever read in Star Wars. It's the best war story I've ever read in Star Wars. I'm gonna give this a 4.7 out of 5. I really love this book, and I'm so excited I finally got to read it. So that's our thoughts on Shatterpoint. Thank you so much for watching. Let us know down in the comments if you've read this book, what you thought of it. Hit a like button down below and subscribe to our channel for continued Star Wars content. We will be having more videos out next week. We have the next episode of Star Wars Lads Versus out on Tuesday. And then next Friday, we will be having our next tier list. If you're not following the polls, we are posting the polls for our Star Wars bracket that we are currently doing. If you are interested in seeing what that is about, there will be a link to that video that explains the whole bracket in the cards of this video. And our ultimate bracket video will come out 2 weeks from today. So make sure you check that video out and that you are voting in the polls. We are releasing 2 polls a day, basically, until that video comes out for the next 2 weeks. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.